So a lot of people think that we are innately wired to be great lovers, enthusiastic perhaps, but we aren't really wired to be good lovers. Sexual skills are learned, and if people think that they innately have them, that's not necessarily true.
And I remember the first time I ejaculated, I just laughed my head off because it was the strangest sensation of having liquid come out of my body. Like it was just such a different sensation, and it made me giggle, and I got kind of a euphoria, I think, from it. I know my face would get flush. I would feel myself get hot, like I was blushing.
Manipulating the G-spot, I can do it in a very tender way, and it has a different sensation than if I do it in a more, I don't really want to say violent, because it's not really violent, but a more aggressive way, you know, like if I'm smacking my clit really, really, really hard.
Female ejaculation comes from the female prostate, which is what the G-spot is. And in 70% of women, it surrounds the urethra and starts right at the outside opening of the body.
You can't address it without addressing the whole body, the genitals that it's part of, but also the whole body that it's part of and the processes of the body. Nor can you address any particular aspect of sexual functioning without looking at sexuality and the way that people learn about sexuality, the way that people are encouraged either to explore their bodies or discouraged from exploring their bodies.
What happens is this synthesis in the mind-body connection where you literally know your whole interior topography. I can feel I can feel the top of my where my cervix is. I can pull my uterus by just doing a few Kegels. I can feel the whole inside of my vagina or yoni. I can feel my G-spot. I can feel my clitoris on the outside. So what happens for a woman when she knows her inner topography, she can advocate for herself much faster for pleasure.
Amazing experience. Everybody should be able to know how to do it. Everybody.
The way female sexuality differs in America than it does in other cultures has a lot to do with us being settled by the Puritans, who brought over the Victorian era models of chastity and purity. And so our sexual mores came from the more patriarchic societies and the religious beliefs. So women and sexuality were not seen as something to be cherished. And this went through all the way up until the 1930s, where women were finally given the ability to vote and were starting to be seen as equals with men. The birth control pill was developed, which was allowed women more freedom of sexuality. So the birth control opened up things for women. But then you had in the 50s a model of the family and of a marriage in which the wife was the housekeeper, the mother, and basically was there sexually to be there for intercourse with her husband and not being able to express what she wanted. In the 60s and 70s, you had the women's movement come up, and yes, women became freer with their sexuality, started expressing it more, having partners and having sex before marriage, and that was all good and well until there was a somewhat of a feminist backlash in the 1980s, especially around pornography. And you had two camps of women, one who thought that pornography degraded women and therefore should be repressed, whereas another camp thought that pornography was freedom of sexual expression, and can't we use this to enhance? In my mind, they haven't been reconciled. There is still, especially with internet porn, there is still that kind of view that this is degrading for women, when in reality, pornography, in my eyes, can be used as a sexual enhancement technique or a way to get aroused. And as we're moving into today, it's really disheartening when you think about that there still are some of those roles that were put out there of what female and female sexuality should be. There's still for teenagers that slut, good girl distinction, which is really disheartening because it's repressing them from engaging in sexual experiences that can help their growth and help them become sexually healthy adults. You have these abstinence-only virginity pledges, which are unrealistic, and kids are going to engage in behaviors that they want to. It's been that through the years. They're always going to engage in kind of sexual behaviors. But it's important to think about what is still happening with women after decades of being seen as equal, that our sexuality has to be repressed and that the good girls don't is still there.
Well, I'm going to address the G-spot, but you can't address the G-spot. The Grafenberg spot or the paraurethral sponge, as some scientists call it. These days, scientists are calling it the prostatica femina. You can't address it without addressing the whole body, the genitals that it's part of, but also the whole body that it's part of and the processes of the body. Nor can you address any particular aspect of sexual functioning without looking at sexuality and the way that people learn about sexuality, the way that people are encouraged either to explore their bodies or discouraged from exploring their bodies. So even though it's 25 years after the first real popular book about the G-spot came out, which is where we derive the term G-spot, the sort of contraction that people have learned to think of it as. It's 25 years later, and yet many people are confused about what it is, what part of the body it is, how it functions. Does every woman have one? How do you get to do it? Is it associated with ejaculation? There are so many questions that remain up in the air. Sexual science hasn't completely set all those questions to rest, partly because in the United States, sexual sciences is in a little bit of a difficult pattern, not enough money, with mainly funding having to do with helping people abstain from sex if they're too young to have it, and to address whether or not sexuality is dangerous and may promote HIV and other kinds of sexual problems. Because the fact is, if you have questions about your own body or your partner's body, it would be great to live in a society that prioritized answering all of those questions.